Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the two kingdoms you're probably most familiar with, Kingdom Plantae and Kingdom Animalia. We're actually going to spend like 90% of our time talking about Kingdom Plantae just because there's a lot more like nitty-gritty information that you need to know, and since we are animals, we have a good idea of what animals are like and the basics of what makes an animal an animal. So let's dive into Kingdom Plantae. So to start off with, we're going to do an overview like we've been doing on all of the other kingdoms. So for plants, they are all eukaryotic. That means that they have a nucleus. They have a cell wall, just like fungi do, but it's made up of something different. It is made up of cellulose, which is just like another starch. It's another carbohydrate. It's just a different one. So fungi have chitin, plants have cellulose. They are autotrophs, which means that they go through photosynthesis, they make their own energy, and they are all multicellular. Now here's the nitty-gritty I was telling you about. So there are 4 plant divisions, and we're not going to get into too much information about them, but you do need to be aware that there are plant divisions and what they are. So we divide it into 4 different types, and it's really based off of whether they have a vascular system and how they reproduce. So the first one is bryophytes, and bryophytes are like mosses, things that you would find on like the forest floor or like lower parts of trees. They reproduce asexually with spores, and they do not have a vascular system, which just means that they're like, they need other things to get their nutrients. And then there's phyllosynophytes, which are like ferns. These are like the things you would see in like a doctor's office. The plants that have like the really long fronds, like you can see in this picture right here. They are they're just like your typical like office plant. Maybe you have them at home. Ferns are really kind of self-sufficient. They're just good houseplants. They reproduce asexually with spores as well. You'll notice that the first 2 reproduce asexually and the second 2 reproduce sexually. So bryophytes and phyllosynophytes there are earlier in evolution plants. They're pretty cool, but the ones you're probably more familiar with are conifers and angiosperms. So a conifer is like what you think of when you think of a pine tree, or a fir tree, a juniper tree. They all have like a similar aesthetic. They all have pine cones on them, and actually those cones are how they reproduce. So they reproduce sexually using cones. There's a male version of the cone and a female version of the cone, and they produce pollen, and that's how they reproduce. And then there are angiosperms, which are like flowering plants, like apple trees and grasses and tulips, and they also reproduce sexually with pollen and with ovules, like, which are basically your egg cells, and then when they fertilize, they make seeds and they make new fruit. Angiosperms are the plants that you probably see the most of, just because they're literally everywhere in anything. Like anything that bears fruit, like a fruit or a vegetable that you eat, is considered an angiosperm. All the grass that you see, wheat, some trees, all of the flowers, like angiosperms are super popular, like not popular, but they're just everywhere. And then conifers are also your typical like forest tree, so very popular. For reproduction, we sort of talked about this a little bit, but there are some plants that do asexual reproduction, like they use spores, like in mosses and ferns, and then sexual reproduction can be done through cones, like in pine trees, or through pollination, like in flowers. So I mentioned that there's different types of cones for male cones and female cones, so you can see the difference here. Male cones are super tiny, and really all they do is produce pollen, whereas female cones are like the pine cones you think of when you think of pine trees, and they have ovules to receive the pollen, and they produce the seeds, right? The fertilization happens within the female cone. So male cones produce pollen, female cones actually produce the seeds, and then through pollination, like in flowers or in any of the angiosperm examples that I said, pollination is the movement of pollen from the male reproductive structure to the female reproductive structure. Again, the pollen is the male reproductive structure that is going to fertilize the ovule within the female. So pollen again is used, and it will meet up with the ovule within the female reproductive structure, and the ovules become seeds, and then the ovary itself becomes fruit. So when you're eating like an apple or something, the apple itself is the ovary of the plant, and then the seeds inside that you don't eat, those are the ovules. But if you planted those seeds, you could make a new apple tree. Of course, it would take years and years and years, but you could do it. And then I keep using this word pollination, so let's make sure that we know what pollination is, right? It's the movement of pollen from the male structure to the female structure, but there's tons of ways to do it, right? You can self-pollinate, right? A flower can pollinate itself, so it's pollen from the same flower into the ovule of the same flower. There's cross-pollination, which is just two different flowers that are going to pollinate. And this is usually done in two different ways, right? You can cross-pollinate via wind, where plants produce tons of pollen because it's cheap, right? They don't have to do anything. The wind will just take the pollen and blow it through the air, and if it lands on, you know, something that can be fertilized, fantastic. But there's no like surefire way to make sure that pollination actually happens. So fertilization is totally based on luck. So they produce a ton of pollen in hopes for the best chance to actually fertilize. And then animal pollination is probably what you were thinking of when I kept saying pollination before. And this is the use of like a third party. Like a bee will land on a flower, and its sticky little legs will pick up pollen. And when it goes to the next flower, it will fertilize the next flower because it brings the pollen to the next ovule, right? So plants that get pollinated via animals produce way less pollen because it's expensive to produce all of like the nectar for the animals to like come visit them. They have like very pretty petals to like entice animals to come see them, right? They put a lot of energy into all the other parts, and so they produce less pollen because it's expensive, but they know that if an animal lands on them or eats them or whatever, they're gonna get fertilized. So it's like a surefire way to have fertilization happen. The last thing about plants is the importance of them. The number one thing that is like we love plants for is that they produce oxygen. We need oxygen to live, so the amount of plants that exist in the world is fantastic because they produce enough oxygen for us to live. They also make food, like fruits and vegetables, which is what we were talking about, but also nuts, spices, herbs. Pretty much most of our seasoning comes from plants. You can use plants to create medicine, like aspirin, morphine, anti-cancer drugs. There's other things that plants can be used for in terms of medicine, but these are ones that you're probably more familiar with. And then other resources, plants can be used for a multitude of things, like creating shelters, dyes, fuels, paper, furniture, so many things, but we're gonna, I don't want to overwhelm you with the importance of plants, but these are some of the main things that we as humans use plants for. And then very quickly, we're actually going to just do a quick little overview of animals. This is going to be much shorter, but of course the overview includes all of the big key things that you need to know about kingdom Animalia. They are all eukaryotic, which means that they all have a nucleus. There are no cell walls within the kingdom. They are all heterotrophs, which means that they have to eat other things to get energy. They're all multicellular, and animals have evolved from animal-like protists. So remember, protists are very early in evolution, and from those single-celled organisms we were able to create the multitude of animals that you see around the world now. So the last thing we're going to talk about with kingdom Animalia is their reproduction style. So some animals actually do reproduce asexually, but only invertebrates. And invertebrates are animals that do not have a backbone, like snails, clams, sea sponges, anything that doesn't have a backbone. You probably have heard the term invertebrate before. They produce asexually through like budding or like breaking off a leg of like a sea star, right? And then that sea star can grow into a clone of it. So this does happen in worms, like earthworms. You've probably heard that you can like cut a worm in half and it will grow back, right? Jellyfish also do this, and jellyfish are invertebrates. Additionally, animals can reproduce sexually, and there's actually two types of sexual reproduction that animals can do. They can do external reproduction or internal reproduction. You are familiar with internal reproduction, where sperm is fertilizing eggs inside of the body, and then the new embryo that is formed grows and develops within the body. This happens in reptiles, birds, mammals, like this is what you're used to. But external reproduction can also happen, and this involves sperm fertilizing eggs that are already outside of the body, and the eggs will develop outside of the body. This usually happens in fish, and so the eggs will be dispersed into the water, and then sperm will come and cover the eggs within the water. And so they release a ton of eggs because this is not like the most successful way to reproduce. A lot of the eggs don't make it when they do this, but they just reproduce so much and relatively frequently to ensure enough offspring in like the long run. Okay, I know this was a lot, and this was a lot about plants mostly, but I'm really proud of you for sticking through, and I'll see you next time.